From January 2024 to January 2025, Austria's economy showed unexpected 0.2% growth, just steering clear of a recession. But the big question is, how long will this fragile upswing hold? In cities like Vienna and Salzburg, the situation remains tense. The slim gap between recovery and slipping back is a constant worry. Headlines bring a hint of relief, but can it last? The real story is about to unfold.
So unless the uncertainty subsides by the right decisions, we will have to hold back a number of our decisions, and hence we don't know yet in what direction monetary policy should be best moved.
Austria's economy grew by a number so fragile it felt more like a breath than a bounce. Just this figure, a 0.2% growth released in April by the WIFO, might have saved the country from officially sliding into a recession once again. But the mood it carried wasn't one of much relief. It offered some comfort, but was covered with tension. This is because, technically speaking, 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth define the beginning of a recession, and Austria has indeed avoided that by the slimmest margin possible. However, the margin doesn't tell the whole story, does it? Throughout the second half of 2023 and into early 2024, Austria's economy experienced stagnant growth. In some months, the country's industrial output declined, and orders from key sectors such as manufacturing (-3.9%) and trade (-2.3%) all showed a notable drop in the second quarter of 2024. The number of building permits in Austria decreased by 22% below the previous year's level, and is expected to decline further into the coming years, given the volatile economic environment. Austrians weren't spending either. When the 2023 energy crisis reached its peak, many Austrians adapted a defensive approach by saving more, spending less, and postponing most big-ticket purchases. When the 0.2% GDP figure was released, former Austrian Finance Minister and EU Commissioner for Internal Affairs, Magnus Brunner, knew, as did most economists, that the number was not a sign of solid footing, but rather a technical escape. In other words, it kept Austria out of a recession on paper, but in practical terms, much of the economy still felt like it was walking on ice. When you look deeper, the signals were already of great concern. In June 2024, turnover in industry and construction fell by 7.8% compared to June of the previous year, according to flash estimates by Statistics Austria. The automotive supply industry in regions such as Steyr and Graz has been operating at below capacity levels lately. Orders from its biggest trading partner, Germany, have also slowed down, pulling down Austria's export figures along with it. The export of machinery dropped by 3.5% compared to the previous year, hitting some of the smaller but crucial Mittelstand firms. And what about the people's sentiment? One thing was certain: consumer confidence remained stagnant, to such an extent that even the Austrian central bank expects the country to barely avoid a recession in the coming months. What many economists fear now is that Austria might be entering into what's called a silent contraction. This is a scenario where the country isn't in a definite recession, but its underlying real economic activity continues to weaken. This implies that fewer risks are being taken, fewer investments are being made, and very little new business is emerging. That's what makes a 0.2% increase feel deceptive. It gives a sense of breathing space, with no clarity about what's next. The government's intervention attempts to strike a balance as it continues to emphasise fiscal stability and highlight Austria's relatively low unemployment rate. They go further to cite how inflation has decreased from its peak in 2023. Indeed, all of that is true, but none of it changes the fact that Austria's economy has been stagnant for nearly 2 years and is now barely recovering. Now, this raises a very serious question. Is this the calm before an actual recovery, or just a pause before the next economic disaster? The European Union's economy is becoming increasingly unstable, and Austria's biggest trading partners are under stress themselves. The 0.2% increase is not enough to rebuild optimism, but is it enough to stop the bleeding for now? When you look at most shopping stores across Austria, the shelves convey a familiar unease. Prices have climbed steadily across energy, rent, and food. These are all moving upward in ways that take away the comfort and confidence of all its citizens every single day. Since early 2022, the country's inflation has consistently been between 8.5% and 7%, although it has been pushed back recently to about 2.9%. The pressure remains very visible.
There is a lack of money out there, there's no money to spend. Whoever has money is not spending money.
Energy remains a hotspot in countries like Austria, even as it continues to move past the 2023 energy crisis and move away from Russian gas. The addition of new pipelines from Germany and LNG imports from the United States has alleviated some of the worst anxieties, but costs have remained a persistent headache. As of 2025, household electricity bills climbed 12% higher than what it was 2 years earlier. Even with a better supply, consumers tend to feel the financial squeeze every month. Across all industries in the country, the average wage in 2024 was just under €31,407 per year, or approximately €2,243 per month. As of 2025, these salary bumps are still falling far behind inflation. Workers earning average salaries or below face a real decline in their living standards, with less money for food, utilities, or transportation. How do Austrians respond? They tighten their belts as more retailers are reported a steady but declining transaction volume. Electronics and furniture store managers also took note that while people still bought necessities, they are not really willing to upgrade beyond their budget. This sense of caution only points to memories of the darker days. Austria may be located deep in the heart of Europe, but its economy is anything but insulated. What happens far beyond its borders, in faraway Beijing, Berlin, or even Washington, ripples back quickly and profoundly to it. And right now, those ripples are starting to look more like waves. The latest strain is coming from the growing standoff between the European Union and China. On April 28, 2025, the European Commission announced sweeping tariffs on Chinese-made construction equipment. On the same note, the extra duties on Chinese mobile access equipment will range from 20% to 66%. The EU framed this move as a necessary response to the unfair competition, preferential state subsidies, and market distortion by the Chinese government. But for Austria, this is no distant diplomatic scuffle, but rather a threat sitting right on its doorstep. Austria's exports are highly specialised. When you think of Austria, you think of precision gearboxes, industrial sensors, and engine components. These are all products built with expertise and exported to both EU and non-EU markets. Although China may not be Austria's largest trading partner, it remains an important one, especially for advanced manufacturing firms. And even when goods don't go directly to China, many of Austria's exports are included in German supply chains that do. So, when China retaliates and there's no if, just when, Austrian firms would get caught in the middle. If China blocks the importation of certain EU components or raises its tariffs on industrial machinery, demand could shrink almost overnight. On the other hand, small and medium-sized businesses, which by the way, make up over 99% of Austrian companies, are particularly exposed to this crossfire. This is because these companies typically lack the financial cushion to absorb sudden losses from tariffs, shipment delays, or even client cancellations. Many of them run on lean operations, relying on just-in-time delivery models that might become faulty the moment a container sits too long at customs or a client in Germany pushes back an order. Even the anticipation of trade disruptions is enough to unsettle these firms. Some have already begun scaling back their production forecasts for the second half of 2025, as they are uncertain about what market access will look like by then. However, it is not just eastward that Austria has to watch, it also has to keep an eye on other countries in the west. Austria's biggest trading partner, Germany, seems to be stumbling again. In May 2025, Germany reported a deepened crisis in the automotive sector due to uncertainty with the United States. For Austria, whose economy is deeply interlinked with Germany's, this is a warning sign. Over 30% of Austrian exports go directly to Germany. Another chunk ends up there indirectly, as parts and components are shipped through supply chains that straddle the border. Now add in the United States. President Donald Trump is back at the White House, and with him, a more confrontational stance on global trade has begun. Since coming into office, his administration has continued to signal the idea of increased tariffs on European goods, particularly in the automotive and industrial manufacturing sectors. While Australia doesn't export huge volumes to the United States, many Austrian companies supply parts for German-made vehicles that do. So, if Trump follows through on implementing higher tariffs on EU-made vehicles, it could reduce demand for German cars, which would in turn decrease Austria's role in supplying parts for them. It's like cutting the top of a tree and watching the trunk wither too. Austria's Chamber of Commerce has already warned of the domino effect a move like this could cause. In a recent statement, the government hinted at how a sharp downturn in US-EU trade relations could shrink Austria's industrial export base by as much as 1.5% over the next year. That may not sound catastrophic, but in an economy already struggling with 0.2% GDP growth, it will surely be a significant blow. And there's another aspect to it. Austria's reliance on logistics from Eastern Europe. For example, many of Austria's exports pass through countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic before reaching their final destinations. These transit routes are sensitive to changes in EU policy, border controls, and rising fuel costs. Since early 2024, Austria has experienced modest increases in overland shipping fees, primarily driven by fuel inflation and stricter customs screening. These measures were all a result of geopolitical concerns around the Russia-Ukraine war. That means that each extra euro spent on transport eats into the already thin margins of Austrian producers. Who gets hit the hardest? That would be the medium-sized manufacturers in regions like Upper Austria and Carinthia. This is because these businesses often specialise in highly engineered products for more narrow markets, meaning they can't just switch clients overnight. If their overseas partner delays a contract, that entire month's revenue might witness a drop. However, beyond the export numbers and customs duties, the situation creates an invisible but growing anxiety in Austria's business landscape. More CEOs and small business owners are asking the same questions. Should we delay hiring or hold back on our equipment upgrades? And of course, the answers to these questions aren't always easy. Even financial institutions are on the edge, as some of Austria's regional banks, already under pressure from low interest rates and cautious lending, have begun to reassess their credit terms for export-heavy companies. There is also a growing sense that 2025 is shaping up to be another unpredictable year, with investments being paused amid declining confidence. Last month, the European Central Bank cut interest rates for the 8th time since mid-2022, dropping them to 2%. Its mood has shifted from cautious optimism to holding steady, which is a signal that inflation is in check, but potential growth remains weak. That's the challenge facing countries like Austria. Inflation is stabilising, yet real growth is too low to spark any strong economic rebound. The ECB could cut further, but that would risk forcing inflation downward and weakening euro stability amid rising geopolitical uncertainty. Austria's stagnation isn't far from what is happening in Germany and France. The European Commission also predicts that Germany will remain flat or experience slight growth in 2025. France, on the other hand, is expected to decelerate strongly by about 0.6%, while Italy remains in a slump. Austria's fiscal position adds another issue to the mix. Its budget deficit is projected to hover above 4.4% of GDP in 2025, and public debt is expected to remain above 80% through 2026. The OENB predicts that Germany's renewed infrastructure spending might slightly boost Austria's growth in the coming year, but that would not be enough to offset tariffs or sluggish investment. For the EU, the situation remains a dilemma. Austrian consolidation helps EU rules, but compromising the country's deficits now limits the flexibility to act during the next downturn. The Eurozone structure amplifies all these as the ECB's monetary policy affects all member states equally, yet these countries are unevenly positioned. This means Austria is squeezed between the need for more growth and the desire to avoid inflation. Meanwhile, France and Italy whisper that Austria should allow looser fiscal expansion, while they continue to rebuild. By April 2025, Austria's trade data showed a narrow surplus as exports declined by 1.7% to 15.8 billion euros, while imports rose 1.5% to 15.49 billion euros in January alone. WIFO predicts that exports will shrink by 1.5% in 2025, while travel remains the only bright spot left. A weakened trade means Austria's economy is unbalanced, and if one shock hits the country, the entire country could dip back into a technical recession. Austria's 0.2% growth is no cause for celebration in that context. If Austria can't expand when economic sensors are green, what happens when red flags return? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please ensure to hit the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.